my trajectory of my life and some of the formative things that have happened to me over the years. I am where I was very privileged to be an exchange student my senior year of high school, and lived in Stockholm, Sweden. My host family were the father was a Swedish Lutheran pastor, and it was on the island of Kungsholmen in Stockholm, where the city hall is for Stockholm, where they award the Nobel Prizes each year. And I was going to high school on the island and learning Swedish. And one of my friends that I'd made, my classmates, was a Jewish boy. Being a rather naive kid from the Midwest and growing up at Proctor Farm like I did, I didn't have a lot of experience with Jewish people, but I just knew that there were Christians and there were Jews, and hadn't given it much more thought than that, other than what I'd read in history and so forth. But my friend in the spring of that year invited me to go come to his house for dinner. And I told my host family that I was planning to go to this fellow's house for dinner, and they were aghast and in shock that I would even consider going to the home of a Christ killer. And that was my first personal encounter with anti-Semitism. And it was vehement. It was really strong. But I insisted, and I went to the dinner and so forth. And I'm not sure my host family ever forgave me for that. They were kind of cool after that. It was near the end of my time with them. And so, and they never really wanted to talk about it beyond that time. So that was a pretty out of the blue, hit you between the eyes kind of experience. And I've thought about that throughout my life as I've struggled with various forms of prejudice. I later on that same year, it was actually in the fall, I started college. This was 1964 at the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York. And of course, the civil rights stuff was swirling around in this country. The previous summer had been the March on Washington, and there were bombings and killings and so forth and so on. And it was, the whole country was in turmoil, and the TV images were shocking. But I was here going to school on the shores of Lake Ontario in the far north. And during freshman week, my roommate and I were awakened at midnight. My roommate was a Black man from Rochester, and there was a knock on the door, and we opened the door, and 3 guys standing there in white hoods. And they threatened me if I said anything to anybody, and they grabbed Henry, my roommate, and dragged him out the door, and later learned that they took him out behind the football stadium and beat him up pretty badly. He was bleeding and didn't break anything and didn't need stitches, but he was pretty shaken and hurt. And I went down immediately once they left. I went and got the RA, and they notified the campus police, and we eventually found Henry. But that was the second shot out of the blue. I was aghast. The university was aghast. Everybody was, that this would happen in the far north. and that had happened at the school. We never knew who it was. I don't believe they were ever found, and it's uncertain whether they were even students or related to the university in any way. But those two events in my young life, at age 17, and over that summer I turned 18 before I started college, I have gone back and reflected on those events throughout my life, and they've really influenced my thinking about prejudice and the widespread racism and anti-Semitism that exists in our world. And so I've made it part of my own life to try to address those issues as well and as best I can. One of the things that triggered this whole thing for me again was doing a story sharing evening where the scripture text was from one of the Gospels and referred to the Jews who were criticizing Jesus. And we often forget that Jesus and his disciples were Jews, that most everybody in the Gospels, with a few exceptions, are Jewish. It wasn't like Jesus and the Christians on one side and the Jews on another. They were one and the same. And but people, including Hitler and the Nazis and Hitler's theologians, use these texts as pretext for the Holocaust. And so I always try to inject a little history and a little reality into reading those texts, that when we get to those points, I say some of the leaders of the Jews or something to that effect, rather than just the Jews. But it's embedded right in our tradition, if you want to be literal about it, and we need to safeguard against that. So those are my stories, and I'm sticking to them.
Thank you, John. I'm wondering, can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
I appreciated that night during the story sharing where you added, where you, in some ways, like you said, you injected this complexity, this nuance to say it's not always either or, that we were in some ways like all in the same there, and it's not all the Jews. It makes me think about these stories that you had. A couple of the things that you said, both about your family, your host family, that they were beloved to you, that you loved them, and that there was this close relationship there. And you used the term aghast. Both they were aghast that you were going to go visit, and the school, and that you were aghast that this happened to Henry. At that school and in the North. And I just wonder, as you've reflected back on these stories, what has that meant to you in terms of like reconciling those relationships with these people, these places that you kind of, in some ways that, there was this other piece of them that came forward to you, that it was exposed in that moment. I just wonder how you've made sense of that over the years, and how you do now.
Well, one of the things that I realize is that a great deal of our prejudice and of systemic racism it really is systemic. It's not that little children wake up one morning, decide to be prejudiced. Or wake up and decide to support the systemic racism that exists. It's just all around us. It's like the water that we swim in. You know, we're unaware of it to an extent, or the air we breathe. So in the case of Sweden, you know, and my study of history and so forth, Sweden was neutral during the Second World War. And there was a lot of debate within Sweden about whether to support or oppose Hitler. And Sweden stayed neutral because they had a lot of iron mines, and they sold iron to both sides. Hitler didn't invade Sweden because he was afraid they'd blow up the iron mines and his supply would run out. So there's been a cultural prejudice against Jews in Sweden for, I don't know that my host family ever read scripture and decided to be prejudiced against Jews. I think that may have contributed something to it, but it was just a cultural thing. And of course, here in the U.S., we have an entire culture that even makes that makes whiteness a good and blackness a negative. Even little black girls, they're so acculturated, often choose the white doll to play with rather than the black one. And with 6 black children in our family, we've seen that. I have my oldest son, whom we bore, or my wife bore, had nothing but women pediatricians until he was about 8 years old. But we heard him at age 5 or 6 one time explaining to one of his friends that the woman in the show they were watching couldn't be a doctor. Women can only be nurses. Now, where did he get that? It didn't come from us. It didn't come from his own experience. It came from his playmates, the television he was watching. It came from the culture. So you can't, I try not to blame people who exhibit prejudice. I try to confront it when I can, and or to understand it, where it's coming from. And if I can, to explain how there's another way of perceiving. I didn't have that ability at age 18. I'm not sure I have it very well now, but so another experience I had a few years after that was when I was in seminary in Washington, Alexandria, Virginia Seminary in 68 to 72. And the Vietnam War and protests were going on all around us. I remember writing a paper, theological reflection piece, about how we were all children of God and bound up together, those who protested the war and those who were against the war, and that we need to remember that. So there's been very little time in my life where there hasn't been a lot of controversy between people for one thing and opposing it, and a lot of strife.
Mhm.
And of course, this week we're very conscious of gun violence, and we need to remember that there are. I don't for a minute believe that there isn't evil in the world, but at the same time, I think there are good people on all sides of these debates. Um, and we need to take the time to hear and to listen and to understand. Not that we need to back off if we are for gun control, but we need to understand why a good human being would be in favor of no gun control.
Yes, yes, yes. That's where, I've been, yeah, I think for me, that's what beloved community is being able to hold all those complexities, which is why I ask you that question of, what you did with that text was you invited that complexity. And then in your stories, even in the way that you've told them, you, you speak of that, you acknowledge that, again, your host family, it wasn't that they were evil or ignorant. There was no shame or blame or any of that, John, in the way that you told the story. And I think it feels to me like that is the practice for us now in such a divisive time when it's so easy to judge people.
Mhm.
And of course there is some of that. I mean, as you say, it's not that you back down necessarily. That's what love is. It is there is an accountability with it, but it's a very different kind of like, how can we hold the difference, honor the difference, celebrate that?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and
Yeah,
yeah. Well, thank you for
you're
sharing your
welcome.
stories. Yeah. And is there anything else that you would add here? I mean, I think, you've offered kind of these two formative stories when you were 17 and 18, another when you were in seminary. It
Mhm.
feels like maybe I'm just curious, now at this particular moment in your life, like, I guess I don't know, what is working you? That's the language I use. Like, where are you now in terms of how you understand what it means to be part of the beloved community, or how are you making sense of all this now in your role as faith leader, father, partner, friend, all the things?
Mhm. Well, if I one of the things I realize is that um, life continues to be very complex, and the longer I live, the more gray and less black and white things become.
Mhm.
Um, we have as I mentioned, we have 8 children, um, and they run the gamut, and we love them all, but they don't all share our values. We have one who's been a guest of the Montgomery County Jail for the better part of 2 years now. He still can't get a trial because of COVID, so that's why he's still in the county. Um, and we have um, the don't put this on the video thing, but Kara's in a mental hospital now in Columbus. Um, I was driving her to school on Monday, and she said, "Dad, I'm having thoughts that are scaring me. Can you take me to the hospital?" And so I took her to Children's Hospital here in Dayton, and they evaluated her and said she was having suicidal ideation and needed to be hospitalized. They didn't have any room in their mental health ward, so they found a place for her in Columbus.
Mm.
Um, they're projecting that she'll be coming home on Sunday. Night before that event on Sunday night, Carol was sitting in the living room playing music and laughing, and
Yeah.
just her normal self. And then the next thing I knew, she's in a real dark place. So